Everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Gameweek 29 free hit. We're going to be looking at the sort of team that I would recommend, but then also some alternatives that I'll suggest over the course of the video. We're also looking into some of the expected numbers for this game week, as well as my general thoughts in terms of how I would create a team if I was to go for a free hit 29 strategy. Now, I myself am not going a free hit 29 strategy. I only have 3 chips left. I have the wild card, the bench boost, and the free hit. I'm pretty much planning to line them up close to back-to-back by wildcarding on 31 and 32, bench boosting on 32 and 30 or 33, and then free hitting on 34, depending on some of the FA Cup outcomes. I might change how I utilize, let's say, the bench boost and the free hit, depending on what the outcomes of the FA Cup games are that will happen after Gameweek 29, but I'm definitely planning for an earlier wildcard and going with the strategy like that, just to help sort of create the best bench boost possible within double Gameweek 32, which I think is probably what I'm going to be lining up for, and that's pretty much it. So with the free hit, though, going back to the strategy, I think free hit makes a lot of sense. I think it also makes a lot of sense for those who would like to wildcard a little bit later, maybe feel like they have actually got a team, chock full of, let's say, Newcastle, Crystal Palace players set up for the double Game Week 32 quite naturally, and probably also have some Liverpool players that they can chop and change as we head, towards some bigger doubles where you're probably going to be using that team value that has been placed over some of these Liverpool players back into other teams who actually will be doubling on 32 or on 33. So that's kind of what the free hit strategy would entail for anyone who's actually going on that path. I think when you're looking at, let's say, assistant manager chips as well, it doesn't really change too much. Some people who actually have a lot of their chips left might actually benefit from using the free hit a little bit earlier, because it's actually really hard right now to plan the chips. At the same time, I don't think anyone's going to use the assistant manager on something like blank Game Week 34. So saving the free hit for 34 could still make sense. But let's just jump into some of the expected numbers for this week. I think, first of all, I'd like to point out that Fantasy Football Hub have their own AI tool, which actually just helps you create the sort of best suggested free hit. If you want to find something quite simple to sort of compare, you can have a look at that in the link in the description below. I myself will be crafting my own free hit. There's no real need for a video if I'm just going to recommend someone else's free hit. I think we can craft something that will be based on expected data as well, but something that's also just based on some of the understandings of the ownership trends as well within the game. So looking at the expected data, I've actually gathered my data from 11fi.com. So my friend 11fi does constantly update these numbers. These will change over the course of the week, and I think even some of the updates from some of the fixtures that happened on Saturday and Sunday and Monday will be pushed through at the end of the week. So some of these numbers can definitely change, and I do think that I can try and guess the changes as well, because we tend to see, of course, when you have one Premier League result, that doesn't change our expectation of teams completely, but it does sort of move the needle a little bit. What I would mention from the start, of course, is no surprise, Arsenal at the top in terms of clean sheets, in terms of percentages. Arsenal have a home game, so you are, from a non-free hit point of view, competing against the likes of Palmer. So that's clearly Chelsea defense. So I guess from that perspective, it might make sense to back Arsenal defense on the free hit and sort of go against the non-free hitters. But it also is the case that a lot of people own Gabriel, a lot of people own Raya and Saliba, maybe a combination of the two, and they're probably going to be rolling towards Game Week 29 with 2 Arsenal defenders. So 1.x Arsenal defenders, I think, is a fair sort of estimation of how much Arsenal defense ownership is within the field. If I look, for example, at the statistics of effective ownerships within certain players, and I look towards Arsenal, for example, I know that for this game week here, in the top 10K, the ownership of Arsenal players or Arsenal defenders was roughly 80%. So you do know that most of the people are going towards Game Week 29 with an Arsenal defender. I think it would actually be a good idea if you're going on the free hit to bet against Arsenal defense, even though I guess you'd be betting for Palmer in a sense. Unlikely, right? With the way Palmer's performing. The next best clean sheet odds that we can get would be City, Everton, and Forest, and not too far behind would be United and Bournemouth and Wolves. Within Bournemouth and Wolves, you've got Kirkes and Ryan Aït-Nouri. What I would mention here is you have to bridge the gap when you're picking a defender. So you're not really looking just purely at clean sheets. You're looking at a mixture of attacking sort of data as well from certain players. I think with City, you get the best of both worlds with Guardiola, where he's an extremely attacking player in all facets of play, a set piece threat at times, also someone who's exceptional at open play. So Guardiola, for me, would be absolutely nailed within the free hit draft. Within Everton, I would say Tarkowski is quite interesting. He's the best set piece threat that they have had historically. His underlying stats do bear that out. He was also very good within the double, if anyone remembers that. What I would say, though, is that the underlying stats are probably still a little bit inferior to some of the attacking fullbacks in the game, which is why I also really like Nico Williams from Nottingham Forest. Clean sheet odds are very, very close anyways to the other two teams. And Nico Williams' underlying stats are very much underrated. A lot of people would be thinking about Milenkovic and his attacking threat, and Aina, who's gotten a lot of bonus and a lot of great hauls this season. But actually, he actually has the most inferior attacking data within the team. I think Nico Williams has very much inserted himself to being the starting player within the team recently. I do think that he kind of meets both, and I would probably actually start Nico Williams as my second defender within this game week. On top of that, picking from a team a little bit lower within the odds, I would like to go with Ryan Eitner. I just think that his attacking data is quite imperious over the likes of the United fullbacks, even though if you look at, let's say, the Arsenal game, yes, Dalot and Mazraoui had great chances. We've seen in recent highlights as well, Dalot having great chances, but I would still pick Ryan Eitner here. I don't think the odds are far enough to suggest that you have to go for a Man United defender, for example, or even, let's say, a Bournemouth one where the clean sheet odds are the same. And actually looking at Kirkus's numbers, it's interesting to see that Ryan Eitner is a little bit far ahead of him, particularly from the expected goal element. I was also watching the Wolves versus Everton game. He was still very much very attacking. And Sarabia did come on the pitch and did change the game and took some of the set pieces away from Ryan Eitner, but that's still a huge perk that he can still have, because it's unlikely that Sarabia is going to play 90 minutes within match. So I think Ryan Eitner does have a lot of attacking prowess, and I would fit him within my starting three. So the bench that I would actually line up with would actually be to have Mazraoui right after that, and then to have Tarkowski. So players that I would go with for this moment in time. In terms of the goalkeeper, I do think that this is one of those cases where you either, once again, look at an ownership point of view and back the most highly owned player, or even sort of clean sheet. And that's a team dependent point of thing. So when I look at the Nottingham Forest effective ownerships, Sells' ownership was actually really low in the previous week versus Man City. This could also be simply because a lot of people chose to bench some of their Nottingham Forest defenders, and Sells, his ownership was only around 14% in the previous week, whereas some of the other defensive players rounded up to being 20% as a total. So I still think there's a decent amount of upside that you can actually get by simply just going for double Nottingham Forest defense if you want to back that. I know a lot of people like diversifying that. When I look at some of the other teams that we haven't actually included, Pickford's ownership is actually really high, so 34%. And that suggests that a lot of people will be carrying Pickford on towards this blank game here. So you might want to back against Everton entirely within the free hit, and therefore the Nottingham Forest double up does make quite a bit of sense. At the same time, a team that we have already mentioned, Man United, their defensive ownership is basically nil, right? You could probably go with Onana if you want to do that. And they are facing off against a team that probably would give you, I guess, the chance, or at least the comfort, that they might be able to get a clean sheet over it. Leicester have been absolutely diabolical recently in terms of the offensive phase, and I really think that they're a great team to target from that point of view. So it really is up to your choice. I think the riskier pick from an ownership point of view is probably going to be Onana, and that allows you to probably diversify your defense the best. Sells is probably my recommended pick for now. And simply just has better clean sheet odds just by a smidge. So that's going to be the defense. In the midfield here, what I find interesting is that I would have probably recommended Son if he didn't have that sort of impact of the Europa League match that he probably has to play a lot of minutes for. And because he's likely to play minutes there, I think he's also likely to lose minutes on the weekend. And for that reason, I'm not really going to recommend Son as a starting pick within the team, but I do think that Son is someone that we can clearly put into the bench for this game, because you're just going to have enough budget to have someone like Son on the bench. He's a penalty taker, has that X factor, less so this year, but we know that the underlying numbers for Son, as long as he plays good amounts of minutes, have still been really good. He's just turned into someone who's a little bit more creative, as the underlying stats suggest. The actual midfield that I would go with is going to be Kluivert, Semenyo, Mbeumo, and Bruno. Now, I think there's definitely alternatives to go about this, but I think Semenyo did come off the game with a bit of a knock. However, he's got a week of rest. I think he should be fine for Brentford at home, and then he's got the international break. So I would think that Semenyo, as per usual, is going to be playing very, very consistent minutes. The alternative could actually simply be to go for Marcus Tavernier instead and just rely on the fact that he actually had a really good performance and a great goal scored versus Tottenham, and is probably going to start in this Brentford match. Kluivert for me is absolutely nailed. Penalty taker. Minutes look even better than like before some of the injuries actually started occurring. Mbeumo is a bit of a staple here. I think it's one of those cases where Mbeumo is too good to ignore. There's not too many players that within the midfield that I would say that are alternates that are actually better than the likes of the highly owned picks like an Mbeumo. As far as Bruno, he has a standout fixture. He's been absolutely carrying Man United on his back almost scored a brace versus Arsenal and is, despite playing DM, just getting points and points and points. But that is what we expect from someone like Bruno, given that he's got so many facets towards points in FPL, regardless of the different position that he plays. So I would definitely go with Bruno in this case on the free hit. He is going to be my vice captain as well. So that's going to be how we go with the defense and midfield. In terms of the attack, before we actually jump into that, I'd actually like to go back to some of the sort of underlying data. So if we look at the goals, the total goals expected for this game week, City's very high up, but I have ignored the likes of Foden because I still think that the minutes between Foden, Marmoush, and KDB are all very precarious. It feels like Pep hasn't really figured out exactly what he wants to do with his team. Sometimes you see Foden play, and Foden had a really good hot patch maybe a month or two ago, and then suddenly he's sort of losing his minutes, benched in some games. Same with Marmoush. KDB has had some good games here and then. It's probably likely that he starts, and he could be quite a good differential here in a match versus Brighton, where they're actually expected to have the highest total goals. But then you never know, once again, especially since KDB's minutes aren't amazing anyways, even if he starts games in recent memory. Teams like Bournemouth are very high up there, which is why we have their midfielders. And also, I think Evan Nilsson definitely has a good sort of leeway within our teams. He could actually be someone that you go with if you, depending on how you feel about someone like Chris Wood. On top of that, I think Fulham are actually not too bad. United as well. But I think with United, you're pretty much covered with Bruno. With Fulham, I think the minutes are still very much up for grabs. Raul can most likely start, but we also know he'll most likely come off as well. As far as Spurs, not exactly a great game. And the same applies for a lot of the other teams, especially Wolves, where they don't have Cunha. And despite having a low sort of expected goals, I think what was nice about someone like Cunha previously is that he was so important to the team. Goal share was really high. Assist share was really high. This isn't exactly the case. And the same applies to Nottingham Forest and Wood. And Everton, where they have clear talisman players that are getting a lot of chances consistently, like Wood and Beto. So those are my thoughts. And then with Brentford, we have someone like Mbumo, who's just exceptional. His own underlying numbers are very strong for a midfielder at the end of the day, if you don't really care about price. So those are kind of my thoughts in terms of players to pick. The forwards, though, is once again, for me, something more close to an argument for whether you want to go against the field with ownership or whether you want to back the field with ownership. Going back to the idea of ownership, with Wood, his effective ownership was around 67% within the top 10K for this game week, but it's very possible that, once again, more people benched Wood because he was an extremely highly owned pick, I think, even in weeks past. So I'm expecting his effective ownership to probably be around 80 to even 90% potentially. That's how popular Wood has been as a transfer, and more people will be transferring into Wood, particularly, I think, as people continue to sell the likes of Isak or maybe even Salah this week. And build up a team. So Wood for me is going to be the most popular pick, but I wouldn't say necessarily that Chris Wood is going to have the best goal scoring odds for sure. We know that he's been scoring a lot of goals this season, but I think you've got a chance on the free hit to probably sidestep Wood. But it comes down to a question of risk preference. If you like the idea that you're kind of securing yourself from all the potential holes in the field from good players who have good expectations, you're clearly not going to go for someone like Palmer, who's highly owned, but you would go for Wood this week here because it's simply a very, very good fixture like Ipswich away. So I think the most ideal setup here is to go for Wood, to go for Beto, and to go for Haaland, and to play a 3-4-3, as implied by me putting Son on the bench. The reason for this is because you'd captain Haaland, I think, just as the outright best player, or maybe even Bruno, right? Depending on what you think is actually the most sensible. And then Wood within away game with still an amazing match, you'd probably start him within this starting 11. And then Beto with a really good game at home as well, and still racking up some really good numbers despite not scoring for the last 2 game weeks. So he had a great sort of one-on-one that was sort of provided by Alcaraz in the second half of the previous match, had 3 one-on-ones versus Brentford, had a good set piece chance as well earlier within the Wolves game. Generally, Beto has had really good XGI. He's had really good numbers, and still could be the penalty taker when Ashley Young's on the pitch, which is usually quite often. I do think the alternative pick, though, if you are someone who likes to approach this game with a bit of risk, you don't really mind it. I think Evan Nilsson is actually a pretty good shout to replace Wood within a theoretical draft. The reason why I say this is because, going back to that sort of total goal graphic, I don't think there's anything to suggest that Evan Nilsson's going to be a bad pick. You can see the amount of chances he just got within the Tottenham match as well. He's probably the pick that I would go with if I was free hitting over Wood, and I tend to like to take risks, and clearly, of course, it hasn't worked out too much for me this season with regards to Salah, but it has worked out within some of the other circumstances in terms of going against some of the other popular picks. So this for me is a choice. I would probably go with Evan Nilsson myself. So it's really up to you. But this is the 3-4-3 that I'd round out with. I think even within the defenders, you can have a really good and easy justification to play Mazraoui or Tarkowski over any of the players that I've suggested. Probably not Guardiola to replace. Within the midfield, you can also replace someone like Semenyo. I think that the alternates within the midfield position could be interesting depending on the minutes within, let's say, the European games and how we kind of assess that going forwards. I mentioned this because someone like Garnacho could be quite free to play good minutes over the weekend, and he's actually been quite electric. He's got a really good game, hasn't really gotten any returns recently, but he'd be someone that I think about as a really good midfield alternate. I mentioned as well Marcus Tavernier as well as a bit of a Bournemouth differential, someone that no one would ever get, right? Semenyo's ownership is already quite high within the game. Having Marcus to have is actually going to be really nice as a differential, as someone who's really low owned. Some of the city midfielders, given the significantly high expected goals as a whole for City, could be interesting too. But I just don't love them. I feel like it's really hard to tell the minutes perfectly right now with Foden, KDB, Marmoush, these sorts of players. And it's also, I think, a reality just to mention that their minutes aren't great. This is a tough match for City as well. So it's also likely that they come up with a little bit more of a defensive kind of setup, as opposed to, in some games when City have a really easy opponent, they could theoretically play KDB, Marmoush, and Foden as well within one match and start them all. So it's very unlikely that the attacking players will get too many minutes outside of Haaland. So that's kind of why I've skirted around suggesting some of the City midfielders. But I would probably go with a double or triple up of Bournemouth just because they're such a strong team and such an interesting team to back, with Garnacho being a really good alternate, and maybe even, let's say, a Nottingham Forest player as well, given that we haven't tripled up on this draft, and you could very much go for those sorts of players. But those are my thoughts in terms of the free hit. I think the free hit, as ever, is always a chance for you to go with players with theoretically high upside. Last season, when double game week 34 was so popular for some sort of managers, a lot of the picks just happened to work out in terms of the low owned free hit picks that were very sort of high upside. The likes of Odegaard, the likes of White, the likes of Elise and Eze, who just weren't really owned within the game in teams. And I think this does present you with an opportunity. You're probably going to have a better team than most. Why not take the gamble from a kind of risk perspective as well, given that you're sort of playing with house money? So those are my thoughts in terms of the free hit. I hope you guys have a wonderful week regardless and enjoy the content to come. Take care and goodbye, and I'll see you guys soon.